Thailand, a nation once on a warpath against drugs, is now a decade later admitting defeat. Users in Thailand may get rehabilitation rather than jail, under broad changes being introduced under the country's narcotics policy. The kingdom is reviewing its zero-tolerance approach, which has caused its prison population to inflate without actually controlling the great quantity of illegal drugs. The focus is currently on meth, formerly known as methamphetamine, which has been the favourite choice of drugs amongst Thai users. This because it has acted as a substitute for heroin, after successful eradication efforts by neighbouring Myanmar, the source of much of the drugs flooding through the region. A single meth pill costs as little as $4 on the streets in Thailand. Thai Justice Minister Pemboon Komchea says he is looking to declassify meth from a Category 1 substance, which could reduce jail time for the possession or dealing. However, he says Thailand is not ready yet. The number of inmates jailed for drug convictions has almost doubled over the past decade. Corrections Department figures for July showed a prison population of over 321,000, with around 70% jailed for drug offences. Despite Thailand having only 10% of the bloc of countries representing the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, it is approximately 40% of the prison population. This has been a result of unsparing sentencing that puts even minor users behind bars. Thaiwachi Chewat, the prison commander of Klong Prem, Bangkok's high-security complex prison, says that his country needs to change sentencing and make a distinction between small and big-time dealers. He also questions the Thai mentality that prisons are a solution for all crimes, including drug crimes. One former female inmate, who declined to be named because of the social stigma attached to drug offenders in Thailand, says she was jailed for 3 years after being caught with 20 meth pills. She said that her boyfriend was the dealer and she was carrying the pills for him. She sadly concedes now that her son wants nothing to do with her. Some say that disproportionately large numbers of prisoners are diverting resources away from tackling drug traffickers. Thailand has a checkered legacy of drug control. Former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra launched a war on drugs in 2003, which Human Rights Watch said resulted in some 2,800 extrajudicial killings in the first 3 months of his campaign alone. Thousands of drug addicts were also coerced into treatment. But this hasn't worked, and it is a result that recent discussions on tackling this is happening. The country and region may remain a large and growing market for meth. Drug producers are anticipating an explosion in domestic use. The situation has sparked a crisis, and the reality is that the discussions surrounding the issue have not yet turned into actions. Until then, Thailand's prison population will continue to grow drastically, and its war on drugs will assume defeat. Khadija Ahmed, Asia Wired.
Now joining me to discuss this is Steve Rose, Senior Policy Analyst at Transform Drug Policy Foundation, which is a charitable think tank that campaigns for the legal regulation of drugs both in the UK and internationally. Thank you for joining us, Steve. Firstly, do you think this new approach by the Thai authorities will work?
Yes, I mean, it'll certainly work better than what they're doing currently. I mean, they've had a very punitive approach to drugs historically, and it's, as your report showed, I think very clearly, it hasn't worked. It's very expensive. It fills up their jails to bursting point. It hasn't deterred drug use because drug use is still rising. It simply hasn't worked. So I think the general idea that you approach this policy as a health issue rather than as a criminal justice issue is fundamentally sensible, and evidence from elsewhere around the world supports that. So I hope they actually move from discussing it to actually implementing it, and I'm sure when they do, they will get better results than they are currently getting.
And does your organisation propose, further sort of policy changes? Do you have any?
Yes, I mean, we think that drug use, and particularly problematic drug use and dependence and addiction, really need to be dealt with as public health issues and not to be treated rather than crimes to be punished. historically, a punitive criminal justice approach to drugs has not worked. It doesn't reduce the scale of the drugs market. It doesn't seem to deter use. But we do know that if you invest in treatment of people with drug problems, if you invest in education of people to encourage them to make sensible decisions, and if you invest in drug education and prevention with young people, you do actually start to get positive results that we all want to see. You see lower levels of drug use amongst young people, you see lower levels of drug deaths, you see lower levels of drug harm more broadly. And so that general realignment from a criminal justice approach to a health approach is obviously sensible. But ending the criminalization of people who use drugs is only part of the answer, because that still leaves an illegal market controlled by gangsters and criminals. So in the longer term, we may need to look at regulating some of these drugs in the same way we do with legal drugs like alcohol and tobacco. So you have a legally regulated market that the government can control, rather than leaving the control of those markets with the worst possible people, which is effectively violent gangsters.
So now looking at the wider issue, of course, Thailand is within the Golden Triangle region. Has it improved in recent years? Or has it been one step forward, two steps back?
Well, one of the problems with historical attempts to control drug production is that you can get successful localized enforcement responses. So you can have a big clampdown on, say, opium production in the Golden Triangle, and everyone goes, look, it's a success. These countries aren't producing opium anymore, or they're producing a lot less opium.
So but of course, the Golden Triangle is the area of Thailand, Laos, Myanmar and China, just for the benefit of our viewers.
Yes, the Golden Triangle is the area that has historically produced a great deal of opium for the global market. But when they've reduced opium production there, what's happened is that opium production moved somewhere else. In this case, it's moved to Afghanistan and to Mexico and elsewhere. So the problem is that when demand for drugs exists, and you have a global illegal trade that doesn't respect international boundaries, clampdowns in one place tend to just move production elsewhere. It doesn't actually get rid of it. It just moves it. So it doesn't get rid of the problem, and it often can end up making the problem worse. So we have to accept the reality that there is not an enforcement, there is not a policing response that can somehow magically get rid of drugs. Drugs are a reality, whether we like that or not. They are part of society. They always have been part of society. And we need to move from an eradication, a sort of zero-tolerance eradication approach, to one that's based on managing the problem to reduce the harm that it causes. And our argument is that we shouldn't criminalize users. We should deal with them within a public health sphere. And we shouldn't hand control of the markets to violent gangsters. We should control and regulate it, as we do for pharmaceuticals and for alcohol and tobacco and other risky products, because these drugs don't become less risky. They actually become more risky when they are supplied illegally. So you don't actually reduce health harms, you increase health harms. You make the products more dangerous, you encourage more risky using behaviors, and you encourage people to use these drugs in more risky environments. So the whole idea of the war on drugs, that it somehow protects health or reduces crime, is completely wrong. The exact opposite is true, and we need to acknowledge that and start exploring different approaches to this challenge.
And do you think it's also, of course, legislation is one thing, and like you said, the war in terms of the drug problem goes beyond in terms of the supply of drugs. Do you think is also linked, the Thai authorities also have to look at the more societal sort of reasons why people take up drugs and why it has become so popular, especially in Thailand?
Absolutely. I think that's a very important point. A lot of people think that levels of drug use are somehow directly related to the successes or failings of the war on drugs or drug enforcement. And in fact, drug enforcement is relatively marginal in terms of the impacts that it has on drug use. The key drivers of drug use are cultural, social, economic trends, which are part of a much bigger social policy challenge. dealing with things like unemployment and inequality and disillusionment amongst young people. Those are much bigger challenges. And there simply isn't any magical solution, certainly not a policing and enforcement solution that can deal with those problems. But we have to acknowledge that, those are much longer term challenges that we may not get to grips with in the short term. So in the short term, we need to manage the reality of drug use as it currently exists. We can't base policy on what we wish the world would be like. We have to base policy on what the world actually is like, on the reality of drug use now. And that means managing drug use and drug markets to reduce the harm that it causes. And that means either government in control of those markets or violent gangsters in control of the markets. There's no third option in which those markets somehow magically disappear just because you've declared war on them. Okay.
On that note, Steve Rose from Transform Drug Policy Foundation, thank you for joining us. But that brings us to the end of this week's edition of Asia Wide. Join us next week where we'll be connecting you again to the issues facing the world's largest Muslim community. Until then, join the conversation online and share your thoughts at Islam Channel CA using the hashtag AsiaWide or email us at the address below. Have a great week and see you in the next edition.